Hello everyone, welcome back. I'm Lucy Henderson, I'm head of the regulatory management team at the SRA. I hope you found this morning's session really useful. I found it fascinating hearing the different perspectives from the panelists and the insights from Jim as well. In this session, we're going to talk about workplace culture and ethical behaviour. As with the earlier discussion, we'd really like it to be interactive. So I'm going to start off with some questions to the panel, but do have a think about any questions that you might like to raise as well. As before, we've got colleagues with the roving mic, so they'll come to you, which will help for the recording purposes, and I'll try and get round as many people as possible. So first of all, I'd love to thank our panel here today. We have Louise from National Highways. We have Lucinda, who's a legal ethics solicitor and consultant. Sangeeta from NHS Resolution, and Claire from BAE Systems PLC. There's full biographies for each of the panelists in the programme, and I'm sure that some flavour of their experience and background will come out as they're answering the questions and contributing today. The topic of ethics is a very wide brief, obviously, and covers the whole profession. But what we really want to look at today is specifically the in-house working environment and the impact there on ethics and risk. And I'm going to start with a very open question, actually, to get the discussion going in the first instance. So, as in-house solicitors, we've touched on this already this morning, and I think we'll find some crossover really in terms of some of the themes and topics that will come through from this morning's first session and this one. But as in-house solicitors, there's obviously, you're managing risk, but within that, trying to balance those ethical obligations. And I think a really important part of that is then developing ethical leadership within your team and within your organisation. And so, Lucinda, I think I might come to you first of all, actually, to sort of set the scene. And perhaps you can sort of talk through, what do we mean by ethical leadership and why is it so important?
So I'm a bit of a kind of the odd one out on this panel because I'm going to be speaking, bringing in some of the knowledge that we have built over the past few decades in academia in terms of the research that we have on ethical leadership. It's an area, kind of the ethical culture, ethical leadership is an area of research that I'm particularly interested in. But when we talk about ethical leadership, what we're talking about is a distinct style of leadership. So there's lots of different styles of leadership that we have, kind of research on, transformational, authentic leadership. But ethical leadership has been kind of growing in popularity in terms of people wanting to understand more about it in response, in recent years, in response to kind of with growing awareness around kind of corporate scandals and thinking, is ethical leadership something which is quite central to the discussions? So the definition which is most cited is that from Brown and colleagues back in 2005, so 20 years ago. And it talks about the ethical leaders are those who demonstrate normatively appropriate conduct through personal actions, so their personal actions and through their interpersonal relations with others. And they promote such conduct to their employees, to their kind of followers, through communication, so two-way communication, two-way being quite key there, two-way communication, reinforcement, and decision-making. And so ethical leaders, they focus on ethics. And they are ethical role models within their organizations. They frequently talk about ethics. They make the ethics message very salient in their organization. So that's very much top of their, front of their mind. They not only set very clear and high ethical standards for others, but and this is the important part, through their daily actions, they follow their own standards. So quite visibly, quite publicly, they are setting those standards, not just by telling people, but actually by performing them. And from that, we know people will emulate that. There are other things which the traits of ethical leaders are, they focus on creating that psychologically safe working environment because they really understand that it's really critical for people, their teams, to raise concerns or worries that they might have. They're transparent, they're accessible, approachable, trustworthy, empathetic, compassionate, and the point about engaging and seeking input from others, they really do want to, they're not leading from a kind of autocratic position. They are really thinking that, we are all in this together. I need your views. And the way, kind of the theory behind ethical leadership comes from social learning theory, which is one of the quite dominant kind of cognitive theories there is. And it's based on the idea that we learn mostly by socialization, by seeing what others are doing, by kind of emulating their behaviors and attitudes, rather than being, kind of being told that this is how you should behave. We learn much more through our environment. And just to finish off, I talked about how research is growing on this, and there have been, much research that's looked at positive outcomes that have come from ethical leadership, in addition to, the fact that it leads to more ethical attentiveness, more moral engagement rather than moral disengagement. But we're talking about business, positive business outcomes as well. So, things like organizational commitment, as opposed to, and lower turnover intentions, organizational citizenship behaviors, job satisfaction goes up, work engagement goes up, job performance goes up. So it kind of links, there's positive business outcomes. Another area which I'm very interested in is well-being, but we see that there are positive well-being outcomes that come from ethical leadership as well.
Fantastic, thank you. And those real strands, that sort of interesting piece around bringing people with you, that learning environment. Absolutely. And seeing that perform day in, day out. Louise, I wondered if I could come to you and National Highways. I know Juliet and Natalie mentioned earlier that sort of unique position in a sense of the sort of public-private crossover. But I wonder, how have you gone about developing and building that sort of, ethical leadership within the organisation?
Thank you, Lucy. Yeah, I think, as I say, we started off on the right foot with that, and we do have a very strong ethical framework in place. So we have 3 imperatives: delivery, safety, customer. And beneath that, the core values, which permeate everything we do as an organisation: safety, passion, ownership, integrity, and teamwork. So that's quite a good, solid structure, to guide how we behave as an organisation. And it is so important because, we are a delivery body, but we're also a statutory highway authority. We also write the standards which are used by 143 countries and all the local highway authorities across the country. So one of the things it says in our licence is that we are to be exemplars. So it's not just what we do, it's how we go about doing it. So in terms of embedding that within the legal team, I think you've heard about our outgoing General Counsel, and he's speaking truth to power. And on his retirement due, we thought it was quite appropriate that we gave him a National Highways hard hat that said that very thing on it, because let's be honest, as an in-house lawyer, speaking truth to power is not always easy. But also in terms of getting your junior staff to embody and have those sort of values at the forefront of their mind, I think, again, we use some other simple mantras, which speaking truth to power, which, and also it's never wrong to do the right thing. And also, one which is perhaps slightly different is surprises are only good at birthdays and Christmas. And that if you have to socialise difficult, ethical, problematic issues with your colleagues and internal clients, to get the best outcomes. I think, what Lucinda was saying about you have to embody the values in how you conduct yourself as a senior lawyer, leader. So I always say I'm like Ron Seal. I do what it says on the tin. You've got to be transparent, consistent, trustworthy, and it's only through being like that we can support our junior colleagues to also embody those values in how they work within the business and advise upon it. It's also about being there to provide support to those junior lawyers, and actually a psychologically safe space for the wider business. And we find that we often get people coming to us directly who have got concerns. You know, we have got a formal whistleblowing policy, but sometimes we seem to be the informal psychological safety space, you know, and we also consider our role to embed this ethical culture is to support and advise individuals who may come to us with concerns on how best to go about managing that within the business. And ultimately, if they don't succeed in that, we are there, and the company is our client, you know, and we will escalate it if we need to make sure that we get the right outcome.
Brilliant, thank you. Interesting to hear that it's sort of not just the, you know, it's not just the what, it's the how. Sangeeta, perhaps you can sort of talk us through the experience at NHS Resolution.
Yeah, I want to follow on from both Lucinda and Louise, and I think our main aspect in the NHS is that there is this real strong commitment to ensure ethical considerations that are at the heart of every decision that we make. But within our legal team, we have to make sure that we follow the legal framework as well. So it's about getting that balance right. One of our values at NHS Resolution is to be ethical. So we have 4 values: professional, expert, ethical, and respectful. And so to be ethical, we have to show that we are committed to act with honesty, integrity, and fairness. And for me, ethical leadership is crucial in shaping that culture and values in any legal team that you have across NHS Resolution or in other NHS settings as well. So, and I think across the NHS, you're always going to have that balance of acting fairly with the patient and ensuring that whatever decisions are being made, there is an ethical element to it.
Yeah, great, thank you. Claire, coming to you now, and we've heard from Louise and Sangeeta about, you know, the frameworks, the values. Could you tell us about the sort of the mechanisms that you've got in place at BAE to try and promote this ethical leadership?
Yeah, absolutely, and I kind of mirror exactly what fellow panellists have said. For us, ethical leadership is absolutely crucial. It balances our ethical obligations alongside our legal work and our legal risk. For us as a company, though, it is not just leadership that we want to be ethical, it's the entire organisation to act ethically. And as such, it is part and parcel of what we do and what we expect of our employees. And so some of the things that we promote for that is the onboarding of all our employees. When they're onboarded, they all do ethical training, and that is at whatever level you are within the organisation, and it is mandatory. But it's all well and good to do it once, but making sure that it remains at the forefront of everybody within the organisation. So therefore, we have annual integrity training. That is mandatory. It is face-to-face. It is where ethical dilemmas and scenarios are put to the teams to be able to discuss them, pull out what the ethical dilemmas might be, and then look at ways of solving that and working as part of your team to come to ways to do that. They kind of hang upon the framework of our code of conduct, which sets out the behaviours, amongst other things, of what we expect of everybody that works at BAE. And reflects our company values. And we've all spoken now about what our company values are. Now, our company values are to be trusted, innovative, and bold. And the first one you will note in front of all of the others is trusted. And that is really important. And that is absolutely from top down. In terms of ethical leadership, we have a wealth of material for our line managers, whether they're stepping into it or whether it's for review material, for them to understand what ethical dilemmas or scenarios might be in different jurisdictions as well, different people, diversity, etc. And it supports them in being able to create that speak-up environment. And if a situation arises within their team, how to deal with it, and what support is available to them. We also have ethics officers that are individuals that volunteer for that role, and they sit within every different part of the team, and you can go to them anonymously and raise any concerns or discuss any issues with them, and that's quite a critical one to have as well. So kind of by having those systems in place, it creates that strong legal ethical leadership, because it's the whole organisation as opposed to just targeting those leaders.
Yeah. Great, thank you. So it's really interesting to hear those insights in terms of how you're promoting ethical leadership. Appreciate it's not always easy then in the day-to-day to do that. And I wondered, perhaps, Claire, if I stay with you, just in terms of exploring the challenges that you've experienced whilst trying to get that balance right.
So I thought I'd just really concentrate on one, but there's kind of two limbs to it. And first is employees knowing what is expected of them. So it is absolutely clear, what are your ethical boundaries, what do you expect, so that they know at what level they've got to be working at. And then it's about the communication of that, but also, it's great to have systems in place for people to be able to take their ethical concerns to and discuss them. But unless the employees know how to access that and who to contact, there's no point having them. So it's about communicating that with them as well, to make sure that everybody knows not only what the standards are expected of them, but then how they raise a concern and who to raise that concern with.
Yeah, fantastic. Sangeeta, same question to you. And I know in your area, obviously, you're dealing with other sort of complex issues as well around privilege and so on and the interaction with that. But yeah, perhaps you could take us through some of those challenges.
Yeah, so I was going to say that most of the time, I think in the NHS, it's quite straightforward acting ethically. You want to do what's the right thing for the patient and the right thing for the families as well. And I think as lawyers, we're taught that throughout law school and LPC and everything else that we do. But I think the challenges that we have is where you're facing different principles in the legal framework against those of, say, for example, in the NHS, we've got the duty of candour, which is all about being open and transparent with with the families, apologising if something's gone wrong, undertaking an incident investigation, and throughout that, you're meant to be acting openly and honestly and ethically within that. But then we have to balance that with principles like legal privilege, where if you're working in a clinical negligence claim, for example, you're going to have to balance the evidence that you have in your case. Most of the time for us, it's the defendant trust, NHS trust, and then you have to balance that against, well, what evidence are we going to be able to disclose in the clinical negligence claim? But at the same time, we've got the duty to act with openness and honesty. So it is really tricky at times. And as the sort of senior lawyer in the team, you're often asked to, help navigate through these complex challenges. But, it's something that we have to do, and we can only get better at it. But there are complex issues, and I think that's where experience is really key, and leadership is really key, where you can actually sit and talk and have open conversations with your team and other colleagues across the organisation as well. And most of our time, our client is the NHS. So again, explaining that all in a quite plain English and easy to understand language, that this is what's happened here, this is what we can share, this is where we're going to get up to, and then taking that forward. And I just wanted to add in the NHS as well that we have freedom to speak up guardians as well. So that's another area where, again, linking back to Jim's session earlier this morning about whistleblowing and things like that, it's really important that there's those freedom to speak up guardians in your workplace and across the NHS, and that you can go and speak to them about these things. But I think for me, it's that ethical leadership and making sure that you can navigate those challenges of being open and honest alongside your legal obligations as well.
Yeah, great, thank you. And Louise, same to you. How are you navigating that?
Yeah, well again, we like the NHS, we have some sort of very similar sort of scenarios. We want to be open, transparent and honest, but equally within that, we've also got to manage very real legal proceedings in many different forums. And we try and do that in line with our ethical values. And by having early interaction with our clients, we find is probably the best way to get the best outcome through navigating through that. I often think that perhaps in the private sector, the bottom line essential need to survive economically probably puts more pressure on the in-house lawyer than it may be in the public sector. But even in our organisation, there are going to be times where there is a tension between hitting targets, personal accountability for delivery, and ethical considerations. And I think, making some of those ethical arguments harder to land. and I've heard this morning about the pressure to bend and not break, and I think every in-house lawyer can identify with that. A term I'd never come across until I met my husband was a CLA. Now, he's a monitoring officer in local government. Career limiting action. And nobody wants to do that, but equally, going back to my hard hat analogy, being an in-house lawyer and following our regulatory requirements and good ethical leadership, we have to be prepared to put our head above the parapet. But it's about winning hearts and minds to overcome that challenges, becoming the trusted advisor. That helps you navigate that challenge, because if you've seen them right on the majority of advice you've given them over time, and you've helped them get where they want to be. So you've enabled them, not disabled them, as I like to say. You've enabled them to get where they need to ethically and legally. On those occasions where you have to say, I'm really sorry, we can't do this, they're more likely to accept that advice. I mean, one of the challenges we've had, I suspect, more than other organisations, is when we came into being, we're doing a lot of major projects, particularly in the first 10 years, working with a lot of external private sector suppliers. And also, we've got a lot of people joining National Highways who hadn't necessarily worked in a public sector setting. So, some of the ethical concepts were probably a little bit strange, and rather like BAE Systems, it's embedded from day one. It's also embedded in our supply chain, that this is how we go about doing things. This is what we want doing, but we go about it this way to try and make sure that we don't get those conflicts. That's probably, really all I've got to say on that at the moment. But as I say, it's quite important that it permeates through all the layers of what we do, right down to the people who are managing our network and fixing the potholes, and it's only through that education that you don't end up with so many challenges and conflicts, I think.
Mm-hmm. Brilliant, thank you. And Lucinda, perhaps I can come to you with a slightly different angle, really. Yeah. But actually to have you take us through the sort of the behavioural ethics and in particular how the factors in the working environment can really impact on this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. So if you bear with me, I'm just going to go back into the lecture mode. One of my favourite topics, behavioural ethics. So I want you to kind of critically now evaluate this idea of ethics in terms of ethical infrastructure, in terms of ethical culture. What do we mean by it? And often we normally talk about kind of ethics in organizations from a normative perspective in terms of, what people should be doing. This is, you have the codes of conduct, you have your policies, you're giving training to people, telling people how they should behave, And there's this whole area of behavioral ethics which is very interesting, and it focuses on, that's great in terms of how people should behave, but how do people actually behave when faced with stresses in the working environment, structural factors in the working environment. And so here we're talking about ethical infrastructure made up of two parts. On the one hand, you have the formal system, the formal control systems, which I suspect many of you will have in terms of your code of conduct, in terms of your training, in terms of your policies. And then on the other hand, you have the informal system. And the informal system is that kind of hidden bit of your organization. Those are the informal values, regardless of what is coming through from the top in terms of how you should behave. These are the things which are kind of almost permeate through. That's the culture, that's the kind of norms and kind of perceived behaviors that really go on underneath. And so I think we can all agree that you could have a gold standard code of conduct, you can have gold standard policies that look brilliant, but if no one's following them, then actually your system's really quite weak. And so behavioral ethics very much focuses on identifying what your informal values are. And this goes to really understanding what the organizational talk is like, understanding what pressures do employees really feel? Why are they feeling these pressures? What ethical challenges are they facing, specifically? Why are they facing? How often are they facing these? What types of decisions and behaviours are actually rewarded, rather than what is said that those, what is rewarded, what is actually being rewarded. If you look at the people at the top of the organisation, what qualities and characteristics do they emulate? Who decides what gets promoted, who gets promoted? What qualities are those, as opposed to what's on papers and what people are telling you, this is going to get you to the top. And it's this is what I think we should be focusing more on. I think this is where organisations' in-house teams should be thinking about what are those underlying informal values that are really kind of permeating, rather than, obviously the formal systems are I'm not saying that formal systems don't play a part, they play a huge part. They are the kind of skeleton backbone, but I think there needs to be a much more deeper digging as to what is really going on. And just to also highlight some research on coming from behavioural ethics in terms of the kind of what they call, I love this term, ethical sinkholes. But essentially these are like red flags. These are risk factors. And there are 3 in particular which I wanted to highlight. And the first has actually, I've kind of noticed these as, in our earlier talks, but also speaking on this panel now. The first one is uncertainty. And so, we know that from studies that people who are in environments where there is high levels of uncertainty, they are more likely to downplay the ethical implications of a decision, and that can result, that's like a risk then, you're putting people in a risk of actually behaving unethically, even though they know they should behave ethically, from an abstract perspective. The second is time pressure, which links to stress in the environment. And the profession that we work in is a stressful profession, it's challenging, but time pressure is a huge risk factor because it pushes us to not consider and not deliberately consider the ethical implications of a decision that we might be making. I'm not sure if anyone's heard of Daniel Kahneman. He's very famous in terms of talking about this system 1, system 2 thinking. Well, if we're in huge amounts of time pressure, if we're in huge amounts of stress, we're more likely to trigger our system 1 thinking. That's where we are more prone to making those errors because we are really, working under pressure. So that's another risk factor. And the final one is isolation. I know from research that has been done on in-house lawyers, quite a few studies always bring up the idea, the fact that actually a lot of in-house lawyers are facing isolation in the work that they do. And that is a huge risk factor from an ethical perspective as well, because studies have shown that the more isolated employees feel, the more likely they are then, again, to diverge from what those stated norms and values of an organization might be into what the perceived kind of underlying informal values. And if your informal values match those of your organizational stated values, you'll all win, that's fine. But often, what happens is the informal values, they speak differently to what the organizational values are saying. And that's where the danger lies. That's the disconnect. And that's what really, we should be looking at, I think.
Great, thank you. So in terms of sort of practical examples that you've seen to develop and maintain that sort of good ethical environment, trying to avoid those ethical sinkholes, as you've used that term, Lucinda. Louise, perhaps I can come to you first. What things? Yeah,
well, that national highways, when I said it's embedded in what we do, yeah, it really is. Mm-hmm. We have a staff reward scheme which is based on our core values, so you can actually get some financial benefit or voucher if you act in a way that supports our ethical values and you're nominated by somebody else, which I think it's really good example of small actions being rewarded. So it's getting right down to the lower levels in the business. One of the things that I've been most impressed with, and it goes to the speak up culture, is to support our aim that everyone should get home safe and well, whether that's our customer or our staff. We brought in an initiative called Be the Change, and that was spearheaded by 2 of our executive directors. So they were leading from the front, and the idea was that if somebody sees something that's not right, that they feel empowered to speak up and make a positive change to that. And one of the things which it's caused quite a lot of consternation in in-house legal services is they've done videos of scenarios, and then they've got us in what they call huddles to discuss what would you do in this situation, what is the appropriate way to act. And you've got people at all levels in that room, and it gets people talking about real scenarios, and what would you do if you were put in this position? Should that person have acted differently? So I think that's been a really positive change within the business. As I say, we do a lot, and I'm sure the NHS do a lot as well, and BAA systems. But as I say, that was the one I particularly wanted to highlight because it has covered all 7,000 employees.
Great, thank you. And one of those sinkholes that Lucinda mentioned was isolation. And I know when we were talking earlier, Claire, said that's something that really resonates and sort of as a flag for you at BAE. So again, perhaps you can share some insights of sort of, particular examples of steps that you've taken.
So yeah, I think we'll get on to that, I think, a bit later. And isolation is something, again, like Lucinda, was something that I was going to highlight. But one of the examples that I thought I'd just bring in to maintain an ethical environment is one of the things that we wanted to concentrate on was making sure that our junior lawyer population really understood the environment that they were working in, the behaviours, but also the kind of more solicitor ethics. So therefore, we set up a junior lawyer programme, which is open to all of our lawyers that are between 0 and 5-year PQE. And it aims to bring them together because we have, obviously, sites all over the UK, so not everybody sees each other. So it's an opportunity at least 3-4 times a year to get together face-to-face, discuss the challenges that they have, meet each other, build their network, build their skills. But another part of that is training. And on top of the normal development training and training, in your initial years as a lawyer, it's also training on ethics and specifically being an in-house solicitor. So we sit down, we talk about the SRA rules. This was before the materials, which now is making the job a lot easier, to understand how they apply in-house as opposed to private practice. Because it's really key to make sure that they have that safe space to be able to ask, as some of them call it, the stupid questions that they don't want to ask anybody else. It's that really safe space to explore those potential ethical concerns and sit down in an environment where they feel safe to raise them and discuss them. And it breeds, as you say, it's that you can have as many policies in place, but what is the actual kind of working and breathing part of the culture, and I think making sure that they know that you're concerned about it and you give them the space to understand it and ask questions and develop that themselves creates that culture from below and then all the way up. So that was the one example I wanted to highlight.
Brilliant, thank you. And perspectives, Sangeeta, from NHS Resolution.
Yeah, I think the main thing is that culture of transparency and accountability, which is absolutely crucial. And I think for me, compassionate leadership is another one. We're quite lucky. Our CEO is very compassionate, and she's got a very open door policy, and I think that resonates. And one of the examples I'll give is during COVID, when the pandemic was at its peak. She wrote to everybody in the organisation and gave her a personal number and said, if anybody wants to talk, I'm here, and I'm here to listen and help you as much as I can, because people are going through all sorts of issues. And so for me, that compassionate leadership is crucial. And I think, again, in the NHS, we need to see that coming from the top down, so that people do feel that they have that ability to speak up and be able to say what's right and what's not right. And especially in a culture where a lot of the time there can be, big newspaper headlines about what's happened here and what's gone wrong here. And so that compassionate leadership and that accountability is key to making sure that it permeates throughout the whole organisation.
Great. And Lucinda, perhaps just to wrap up on this particular area with you, and you've obviously spoken so informatively around that behavioural ethics and so on, but any sort of points coming out in terms of specific practice that you want to pull?
Yeah, probably one thing which I don't think I see enough of is, or I suppose position it differently, is to say that how often are organisations or teams assuming that there are some issues, or assuming that there aren't some issues in teams and organisations without actually looking at the data? And I think, one thing which I think people should be doing more of is understanding, whether they're the sinkholes you want to call them, or identifying, particular problem areas that you may be facing, rather than assuming that, we've talked a lot about some of the risk factors here, but those risk factors might actually not be playing out in your workplace at all. But before you go ahead and try to mitigate a risk, you would always identify the risk. And yet what I don't see much of is, and this is not just in-house, this is everywhere in private practice, people actually spending the time to identify what the problem is before then taking action, which seems bizarre to me because you're pumping in lots of money, almost throwing stuff and hoping something will stick without actually identifying if you have a particular problem and which area. It might only be affecting a particular small bit of your organisation, in which case you can then take more targeted intervention. So, and I think, so it's more kind of around kind of using data, using evidence, taking an evidence-based approach, but more, and thinking more creatively about the types of data and evidence as well, not just obviously data gathering by speaking to people, surveys, great, but there's loads of, hidden pieces of data that's often normally kind of in, exit interviews, for example, absenteeism data, but there's lots of organisational data which I don't think is synthesised or brought together and integrated enough to really draw proper conclusions to inform strategies.
Great, okay, thank you. I've got one more question, and we'll deal with this one fairly swiftly, although it's a really important topic, but I want to make sure that we keep time for audience questions. And that's around the role of diversity and inclusivity in this discussion and this debate. And Sangeeta, perhaps I can come to you first of all, because I know it's something that you're really passionate about.
Yeah, thanks. I'm definitely really passionate about diversity, equity and inclusion, and I think that it plays a massive role in ethical workplace culture. I think an inclusive environment encourages diverse perspectives, and it fosters that sense of belonging, which I know everybody craves. And I think that also then helps us towards that just culture. So in the NHS, we talk about just culture quite a lot. Again, it's very prevalent in where we are, and raising that awareness around ensuring that staff feel empowered to speak up and say when they've made a mistake or when something's gone wrong, and how it could be done better. And I think supporting those staff to speak up and increase that just culture, you can't do it without diversity and inclusion. And so, absolutely I feel that is absolutely key in any ethical workplace culture. But again, as I say, that fostering that sense of belonging and really listening to those diverse perspectives makes a massive difference.
Yeah, super. Okay. I know we've got some thoughts as well from Lucinda and Claire, but I'm also really conscious of time. So I think we'll go to the audience, and then perhaps we can bring in, some thoughts from you on that topic too. So we've got some roving mics. We've got a question here and then one over there. So if we start there, and then I'll come to you.
Hello. Hi. It was mainly a question posed to Lucinda, really. I suppose the thing that comes to mind when I was listening, it's great to hear all of the examples of good practice. But I suppose I think of organisations where there's an element of toxic culture, or not necessarily toxic culture that permeates throughout the organisation. But if you think of the toxic culture maybe at the top, how can you ensure and prevent ethical blindness? So I have a very strong ethical moral compass, and I'm sure lots of us in the room have, but I'm just concerned that, is there a time when organisations become institutionalised that you become desensitised to your own moral compass or ethical compass? And how do you address that, particularly as lawyers, as in-house solicitors?
That's a brilliant question. I'm going to struggle to answer that one. Because you just hit the nail so spot on in terms of, it's when it becomes institutionalized, that's really, really difficult to, I mean, as in-house lawyers, so you're talking about when it's at the very top and those kind of the ethical blindness is happening to the people that you're reporting to. Yeah. There is no easy way. I mean, unfortunately, you can use all you can do in terms of your reporting upwards, in terms of your GCs to kind of make the case. And ultimately, you're going to have to balance your ethical obligations to remain independent. And I know that others have said, well, if it's in that kind of, you know, describing that really toxic environment, and it's kind of got to that point, then it's, you know, is it your duty either leave the organisation or you have to then report if it's something that has illegality concerns that you have concerns about, then to maintain your ethical obligations, it would be something that you would have, you know, maybe consider reporting. But yeah, it's a tricky situation, and I suspect that possibly goes on a lot more than what we're aware of. Brilliant question. I don't think I've answered it.
I'd like to come at this slightly differently and ask the panel what they mean by ethical behaviour. I recall many years ago having a debate about the ethics of giving the red envelopes in China, and as against when they are potentially suppliers or customers or clients. Many years ago I did some work with Professor Richard Moorhead on ethics and in-house lawyers, and we did spider diagrams of in-house lawyers around the world. And there was material difference culturally from country to country as to what being ethical meant to people. So what do you mean by ethical behaviour, and how do you navigate the fact that lots of people, we heard from Jim earlier that narcissists tend to be CEOs tend to be narcissists. Narcissists genuinely believe that what they're doing is okay. So how do you navigate that complexity?
Who'd like to start? Sangeeta?
I think for me, it comes down to the integrity part, because everyone's going to have their own version of integrity. So acting with that honesty and integrity. And then maybe doing a sense check with someone, you know, I think this is the right thing, what do you think? And having that trusted team around you, and trusted you know, directors or CEOs, etc., that you can go to as well, in order to ensure that you are acting in that ethical way. But I think it comes down to honesty and integrity for me.
And I wonder if some of it ties into the earlier conversation we had around those expectations, those values. I don't know, Claire, did you have anything else?
Yeah, so I think I was going to say that different people have a different definition of what ethics is, and therefore it comes to the diversity point of diverse teams. You can have open discussions about what ethics is, but also so we obviously operate in quite a few jurisdictions, so therefore our ethics teams try to make sure that the ethical dilemmas and the ethical scenarios that are discussed within our integrity training that's done every year try and cover as many different aspects of ethics as possible to make people aware of the wide variety of what ethics can be, but also checking up on that diversity point, because I think you can educate yourself better by understanding different people's views on what ethics is.
Great, thank you. Another question here.
In-house lawyers, thousands and thousands and thousands of people around the world. So if we were all super, super well, maximally vital, of steel backbones, what would happen in the world? And so my question is to Lucinda, because it's not really a question, I would just love to hear you talk to the relationship between well-being and ethics, because it is such a strong nexus. And it's such a foundation for us as individuals. I'm sure we've all experienced times when we are super vital and feel like we can take anything on, and times when we're degraded and it's harder to. So I'd love you to just be able to talk a little bit about your work and insights on that.
Oh, I could talk forever on this subject. I mean, this is, it's like a lifelong passion for me to think about this kind of nexus between ethics and well-being. And I just don't think we don't know enough about it yet. There is so much evidence coming from what we do know. some of that I touched on before about kind of time pressure, the work factors, kind of workload, factors in the environment. We know that those tend to, there's lots of research looking at those factors and how they can negatively impact our well-being. What we know less about is, because we tend to stop at well-being as the final outcome, we don't then look at what the following outcome might be. It's that kind of extra bit at the end. Some fascinating work is happening in Australia where they are looking at ethical culture, ethical climate, more accurately, and trying to see what the link is between ethical climate in lawyers and well-being. And they are finding that, poor ethical climate, poor ethical working environments is leading to poorer well-being. Now, what I'm fascinated in is if you are in a poorer state of wellness, of well-being, does that impact your ability to then consider decisions deliberative enough to make the right ethical decision at the time? And I mean, I personally think that I think if your levels of well-being are low, you're stressed. I mean, I talked about time pressure. It just points to the fact that you're more likely to miss things. You're more likely not to, again, talking about system one thinking, you're more likely to not more likely to take shortcuts. And I think that poses a huge danger to us all. Again, didn't really answer your question, but yeah.
Thank you. I think we've got time. Oh, 2 people. We'll take this lady first, because I said I'd come to her, and then we'll see if we can squeeze in one more.
Hi, a bit of a practical question. For many of us in the room, we've gone into organisations where we can see that there are ethical challenges, cultural challenges within the organisation, but that may not be seen from the executives that we work alongside. I'm interested to know, is there any kind of benchmarking exercise or barometer or sort of a recognised survey where you can bring in something that's recognised that you could bring in to sort of benchmark, right, this is where we are now, and as an organisation we want to improve going forwards, something to sort of flush out the reality of where things are. Just wondered if anybody on the panel or perhaps anybody in the room had experience of working with anything like that.
That's interesting. And panellists, any insights on that and from benchmarking?
There are measures that have been used in academic research, which again can be used in practice. I mean, I can get in touch with you afterwards, but ethical climate for one is something that there's an ethical climate questionnaire which has been used, which I said academic researchers in Australia are actually using that at the moment, so that can be something that could be used in-house. But yeah, I think definitely, as Jennifer just said, it's a gap, and I don't think we are doing enough benchmarking or kind of data gathering, as I mentioned before.
Great, thank you so much. And I'm so sorry that we haven't come to you, but I'm conscious I need to move on now. So thank you all. Thank you very much, the panellists, for those really insightful contributions.